So we're picking up where we left off in chapter 2, here talking about perception. So in perception, we're talking about the process of recognizing information and making sense of it. Your book goes through the 5 stages of it, and that's fine. It's nothing I find particularly interesting or necessarily crucial to know, but there are certain things from that process of perception that I do want to pick out. And one of those is that we engage in what's called selective perception. So selective perception is what it is we choose to pay attention to. Was one of the things anyway, right? So we only pay attention to certain things, the things that are important to us, the things that we think matter. So there's selective attention, the sorts of, again, this is the things that we choose to pay attention to. It's an important thing to recognize about perception is that we selectively, out of all the things that we could see around us and hear, we put our attention on some things and not others. Likewise, in terms of what it is that we perceive, we're pretty good about, as humans, and this goes back to both these really cognitive dissonance theory, which I won't get into here, but we're pretty good about selectively exposing ourselves to certain things. Generally speaking, humans do not seek out things that are going to make them feel uncomfortable and challenge what they believe. So, of what we perceive in this world, we choose what to pay attention to, and we also choose what it is we're going to expose ourselves to in terms of our news, our media, arguments for and against certain things. We're all pretty careful about that. So it does create a certain perception of the world for us because we're very careful about what it is we pay attention to and are ever even exposed to. The book does also note, and I want to reemphasize here, that any sort of stimuli that's really intense, it could be loud, it could be really funny, it could be whatever, right? Or novel. It's new, it's surprising, right, is actually going to break through the clutter of everything else. But otherwise, there's a lot of stuff we just choose not to pay attention to. As we're talking about perception, right, there are certain rules of perception that are applying here. One is proximity. Right? When we see things near each other, we often think those things go together. So there are certain perceptions that we're making just by seeing certain people working together. We assume those people, because they're working together, they have similar values. We see them using the same stores or same services. We assume they must be like each other because they go to the same places. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. We also assume that when people are similar, that they are, we perceive them as being then together and like each other, because they're similar in some way. They're of the same age, and so therefore we assume that they have certain interests, certain beliefs, certain experiences, or haven't had certain experiences, right? We assume that because somebody is similar to some other thing we've experienced, we sometimes go, oh, yeah, had this, met this sort of person before, and we put them to a little category, do a bit of stereotyping there. When we're talking about contrast, again, if we look at something and it looks like, or two things, we'll talk about things, two people, and they don't look like they'd go together because of age, because of dress, we automatically assume that they don't go together, right? And that they don't think the same, they don't think alike, they don't share the same values or have the same experiences or find the same things funny, etc. So again, we rely a lot on these perceptions of things that are near each other, look like each other, or look dislike each other to assume about how things are, or people are really like each other. I keep saying things because general perception, but really we're talking about here people, right? Is what we start assuming is that if two people you see together or near each other, and one is older and one is younger, you start assuming that they have different values and care about different things, which may or may not be true. This does bring up something your book doesn't talk about, and that's the halo and horn effect. We have a tendency when we meet people that when we know one trait about them, to assume other traits are there as well. So if it's a positive trait, if there is somebody and they share the same political beliefs you do, the same religious beliefs you do, maybe even they just like the same music you do, you suddenly assume a lot of other things about them. They're really cool, they're really nice, they're really lots of sorts of other things you don't know based on that one piece of information. It's the halo effect. There's one thing about you I know that I like, and I assume that what goes with that are all these other positive attributes. The horn effect is the opposite of that. You find out something about a person. Again, their politics, their religious beliefs, their choice of music, and based on that, you start making assumptions about the rest of them, and because they vote a certain way, or they listen to a certain music, or I don't know what, wear a certain piece of clothing, you then make other something you don't like. You make other negative assumptions based on that. That's the horn effect. Halo and horn, angel, devil, sort of some problematic imagery perhaps, but the idea is one trait you like and you assume all the other good traits go with it, a trait you don't like, and you assume lots of other bad traits go with it. It's the halo and horn effect, and it's just us jumping to conclusions too quickly. And again, it's this notion related to these ideas of proximity, similarity, and contrast. So one thing that's important to do when we're just talking, but also going through the world, I suppose, is perception checking. Perception checking is something that can happen with a person you're communicating with. You can ask them, wait, so by that, do you mean? Or to say to them, hey, you don't think that, when I'm talking to you, I'm looking down at my phone, but you understand, I'm really listening. I'm just waiting to see whether or not whoever has texted back about this thing. Right, that perception checking, right? Like, hope you don't think I'm dismissing you. Or, are you saying this thing? Or when I do this, do you think this thing? Because I don't want you to think that. That would be perception checking. That's with somebody you're communicating with. Another way you can perception check, actually, is with a third party. So you feel like your supervisor keeps talking down to you. And so this is when you ask a colleague, someone you work with, is it just me or they talk to me like I'm a small child, right? That's you doing perception checking, right? So perception checking is also a good thing to do just in managing our perceptions. As we move from perceptions, we want to talk about impression formation and how it is that or what the sorts of things that we do that helps other people to form their perceptions of us, right, and the impressions that we make on them. And we get into the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So the self-fulfilling prophecy occurs when you make a prediction or you form a belief. So if you're at work and you think, so somebody walks in the door and they're of a certain age, and you say people of that age are always, they're rude, or they're not polite, or you think they're always just so friendly and so nice, right? You make a prediction. Part of self-fulfilling prophecy says, you act on that prediction as if it's true. You say, oh gosh, the people who are like blank, that age, who are attractive, whatever, are always so nice. By the way, we do often associate attractiveness with niceness, but anyway, right? They're so nice. So then you start acting if that's true. You go up to them and you say, hey, how are you doing today? Whereas if you had a negative prediction about them, you might just say, so can I help you? Right? So you're going to act differently based on your prediction. Because of how you're acting, right, certain things are going to happen. When you go up to somebody and you say, hey, how are you doing today? They're probably going to say, well, I'm just fine, thank you very much. And you're going to think, you see, so I've always known, they're just so friendly. You're going to observe, right, they're going to be nice, and you're going to observe exactly the thing that you expected. Because you thought they'd be friendly, so you were friendly to them, so then they were friendly, and that confirms your beliefs. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Likewise, you think they're not going to be friendly, and you just are curt and sort of cool, and you say, can I help you? Yeah, that's fine. Here, I'll get that for you. Just hold on a minute. So then they don't seem very warm and friendly, right? And you go, yep, see, that's what I thought it was going to be. A way of illustrating this is I have something in my head, and based on what's in my head, I engage in certain actions. And my actions lead to your response, which fulfills my prophecy, right? So that's what a self-fulfilling prophecy is. Also, we're talking about impression formation. I want to talk about this debate over primacy and recency. It's really unclear which one has the strongest effect on people, and I teach persuasion. But the primacy effect is the idea that whatever comes, the first impression we have has the most influence. The first time we hear about something, see something, meet somebody, has the greatest impact, greatest influence. There's a lot of support for that. There's also a lot of support but for the recency effect. The idea that the thing that we last had contact with, our last experience with somebody or with a product, has the greatest influence on us. This is the hotly contested debate, but the idea is that the first thing, the last thing, both seem to be pretty important in forming the impressions that we have. Seems to be very important. The stuff in the middle matters less, but the first and last, one of them seems to be the stronger of the two. But the stuff in the middle doesn't seem to matter as much as the first time we met somebody and the last interaction we had with them. One or both of those are really what matters most. Also, in impression formation, we talk about stereotyping. I think stereotyping is pretty obvious what we mean is that we put people into a box. Based on one piece of information about them, we then rely on a belief that we have that may be completely inaccurate about them, about their beliefs, about how they're going to behave, etc. Right? So it's a fixed impression of a group of people. Right? And of course, what it does is it distorts perception, and we don't see the individual for being unique. That's the problem with stereotyping. By distorting perception, we miss out on their uniqueness. We don't see them as a unique person, we just see them as being another one of those. Think about the times that you've been stereotyped because of your race or ethnicity, your age, your sex, gender, your sexuality, your religious beliefs, etc. And you think they don't see you as an individual, they just see you as being part of a group that they may not really understand very well. As we're talking about stereotyping, we have to talk about essentialism. Essentialism occurs when we believe that we could describe another person according to their group, and there are just essential traits to that group. And so you say, well, you know what old people are like. I don't even know what old is right now, right? But you know what old people are like, and there's some sort of essential trait you have about them. Cranky, conservative, I don't know, inappropriate, I don't know, right? But the idea is essentialism is that when you see somebody as part of a group that you do not identify with, you boil them down to being one sort of essential element, right? And that's all you do is you just make them this one thing. And it might even be, in some ways, you might think you're being nice by looking at every older woman and thinking, oh, the sweet grandmother type, if that's been your experience, oh, the sweet grandmother type, which takes away all of the other experiences and other parts that could be there of her. So it's essentialism is boiling a person who seems to be from a different group of you in some way, down to what you see as some essential element. And we do this all the time, and often very closely related to stereotypes that they're often fed by, sort of boiling a person down to this one element. That's all you need to know about them, and that's all you really care about them, is this one essential thing. As we're talking about stereotyping and self-fulfilling prophecies, we get what the book refers to as being the Pygmalion effect. I should say the book, there's research on the Pygmalion effect. And that is that people before, and we see this a lot in educational situations, these studies that have been done, when somebody has been told that somebody is, say, very smart or, say, not very smart, there is a difference in how that we then go and interact with that person that then affects whether or not they perform well or don't perform well, right? So it's like self-fulfilling prophecy, but a little bit different, because here you're told, right? You're told what to expect of a person, and the Pygmalion effect is that then you do things that bring that about, right? That person's a real loner. Okay, then so you never bother to engage them or invite them anywhere, and what do you know? They seem like a real loner. Yeah, they do, because you never talk to them, right? That's the Pygmalion effect. Similar but different to this is something that's called stereotype threat. Your book doesn't talk about this. Stereotype threat, there's considerable research on this, especially related to gender as well as race and ethnicity. Stereotype threat comes when people are aware of stereotypes that are held about them. And when they hear that stereotype, they end up, it's a bit like a self-fulfilling prophecy in this way, when they hear that stereotype, they end up performing in a way that confirms that stereotype. Some studies they've actually replicated are things like giving men and women a math test. And so the men and the women, in one group of men and women, they take the math test and they just say, this is a test of your abilities. Here it is. And the other group, the test, this math test, they tell the men and women, here's this math test, and the researcher mentions offhand, it's been shown, or this test has a tendency to have a gender bias in favor of men. Well, then guess what? On that test, men, their scores are about the same as they were in the other group, but the women's scores fall. Sometimes there's a stereotype there, because there's a stereotype that women are not good at math, which comes from nowhere. I mean, not based on reality, though it is a stereotype that's very, very much active. When people hear a stereotype that they may feel threatened by, right? That they're not going to, that because of their gender or sex, because of race or ethnicity, they're not going to perform as well. When they're reminded of it, they often end up not performing as well. This has been shown repeatedly. That's a stereotype threat. So we're moving now to attribution theory. And attribution theory, I think, is so cool. So here we are, attribution theory. Attribution theory starts by saying that we want to understand people's behavioral motivation. What I mean by that is, why do they do that thing? It could be a good thing, but often it's the thing that isn't so good, and we're trying to figure out, because that's what stands out to us, right? So why are they late? Why did they yell at that person? Right? Why did this customer behave in this rude way? Why did my boss snap at that? Right? So we want to understand people's what is motivating their behavior, their behavioral motivation. And so attributions explain the reason for behavior, right? So if somebody at work, somebody you work with, they seem much more on edge, right? They snap at people much more. And somebody else you work with says, "Man, what's with them?" And you say, "Well, you know, they're grandparents in the hospital." Oh, right. That would be an attribution that would explain the behavior, right? So that's what attributions do. They help us understand what's going on with that behavior. What's that about? That answers the question, what's that about? Right? And attribution theory, as this book emphasizes, I'm very glad to see, says we often assess how much control people have over events. This is one thing that comes up a lot in attribution theory, is measuring whether or not what's happening to a person, what they're doing, how much of that is within their control and not within their control. So in attribution theory, there are errors that we make in our attribution. When we're trying to figure out why did somebody do something, there are three common sources of errors for attributions. The first one is called the self-serving bias. Oh my gosh. Yes, Grant. When we're making our attributions, there are three common sources of errors in those attributions. And the first one is a self-serving bias. And it's just that. It's a bias that serves us. It makes us look better, us individually. The idea that my success, which is how well I did on the exam, which is why I received a promotion at work or why I got the job, right? My successes are because of my own personal attributes, or the things, I guess, the things that I've done, right? I did well on the exam because I studied hard. I got the job because I have better experience. I was promoted because I'm a hard worker, right? So when we succeed, we make those as being personal attributions, right? It's about something within us, a trait of some sort. When things don't happen, I did badly on the exam, I didn't get promoted, I didn't get that job, we have a tendency to make it what we call a situational attribution. It's something about the circumstance. I didn't do well in the test because, I was up all night with helping my roommate with I don't know what, right? But that's why, so I wasn't able to study, right? So it was a circumstance. Or the test was just too hard, right? Not that I studied hard, but the test was too hard, so it's a circumstance. I didn't get that job because the person, when they first saw me, they just didn't like the way I looked. I didn't get promoted because I wasn't the boss's favorite. It was the manager was playing favorites and liked other people, or other people were kissing up to the boss, right? So when we fail, we have a tendency to see it as being things that are outside of us, circumstances, rather than being about us. That's the self-serving bias. The second error of attribution is what's called over-attribution. And this is especially true when we're talking about cultural differences, right? So I see a difference, culture, age, gender, whatever, between myself and another person, and I assume that's the reason for the difference between us, right? So another person has behaviors that are different from me, and we also have some cultural difference, and I think, oh, they do that thing different from me because of, right, that culture. I talk too fast. It's a terrible habit of mine. I'm sorry, I'm working on it. It's a lifelong thing, but I talk too fast sometimes. I've been told this and I apologize. So you say, if you're a native Tennessean, maybe you say, well, he's from California. I bet it's just because it's from California and they're fast talkers. Well, people from California complain about me talking too fast as well, right? So that would be over-attribution, that we see a difference between us and another person, and that other person's from a different culture in some way, and so we assume that that is the reason for the difference between us, right? That's why. And the third error I want to talk about, and your book mentions, by the way, is what's called the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error is the idea that we overestimate the power of the individual. Right? When I began this talk about attribution theory, remember I said that we're interested in knowing how much do people have control over other events. And the most fundamental error that we make here, the fundamental attribution error, is that we assume that people have more control over the things that happen to them than they do. It's really unfair. If somebody loses a job, it's because they're lazy. Well, people lose jobs for a lot of reasons. There's as you know, there's a downturn in the economy. That might be a reason that they lose a job, right? So anyway, we have a tendency to overestimate why people do things. A person's late, right? They're late to work, and we say it's just because they don't know how to plan. And we might overestimate how many other challenges they face in getting here and getting out the door on time. Right. We also have a tendency, like I said, as overestimating the power of the individual, to underestimate how much situations control things, right? To not recognize that when people are in certain situations, it can be really hard to get out of them, right? That bad jobs, bad relationships, bad economic standing, it can be really hard to get out of them because the situation has so many things that might bind us in its place. It's hard to get out of them. So we might underestimate how much the situation we're in actually dictates and controls our choices and responses, right? So there's a tendency in that we have a tendency to say, thinking about the self-serving bias, that I am affected by situations, right? That situations do have a tendency to hinder me in what I'm able to do. But you just make bad choices, right? In general, we have a tendency to say that we are more affected by situations than others, and other people are just more affected by their own sort of bad choices. It's a bad tendency of ours. This is all part of what we call the blame the victim culture. That we blame victims, whether it is sexual assault, whether it is being the victim of a robbery, whether it is a car accident. We're very quick to blame the the person that it happened to, the person who's the victim. We're very quick to do that. Let me just say very briefly, let's say that my wife and I went up to visit my sister and her husband in Washington, D.C., which right now, because it's a COVID-19 hotspot, you couldn't pay us to go up there. But let's say we were doing that. And when I got back, you asked me, how's your trip? And I said, oh, I had a nice time, but gosh darn it, somebody broke into our car. And you might say, oh, crime, boy. I don't know, right? But then after that, you might start asking me questions like, so was your car locked? Did you park in a bad neighborhood? Were you near a light? Did you leave the thing out where people could see it was there to be stolen? Those are all questions asking me, had I done enough to affect the behavior of another person? That's the blame the victim culture. That you think that I'm affected by my own choices, not by the situation. And so again, that overestimating the power of the individual, that I have the power to control what somebody else does when I'm not even around, whether or not they break in my car, is largely affected by me. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't lock your car and you shouldn't be cautious at times. What I'm saying is that when things do happen to people, we're very quick to blame them. You know, so they were rear-ended and we say, well, I mean, did you have your lights on? Did you do this? Did you do that? We're very quick to blame the victim. It's a terrible component of our culture. It's a real problem. And it goes back to what we're talking about here with attribution theory.